This series is brought to you in part by a generous contribution from the law firm Hunt & Williams. Since its founding in Richmond in 1901, Hunt & Williams has grown to more than 800 attorneys and 19 offices in North America, Europe, and Asia, and represents clients across the full spectrum of industries that make up today's global economy. In addition, last year, every single lawyer at Hunt & Williams participated in pro bono service. As a firm, they contribute more than 50,000 hours each year to community service and charitable projects, including many hours of service to this museum. We thank them for their support of this museum and the speaker series. We are in for a treat tonight with someone, and you're going to hear this in Ben's bio, but someone who is truly 100% qualified to lead us tonight on this tour of the great Maggie Walker's Richmond, following her footsteps from the sites of her birth, her church, her office, her business, her home. It's true that Ben wasn't actually born in Virginia. He's actually from the land of Lincoln, but his Richmond connections and his historical understanding of Richmond began to pile up pretty quickly because he moved here when he was 3. He stayed for college at VCU and took a bachelor's in music in 2001, and then went on at the College of William and Mary to get his master's in 2005 and his doctoral degree in American Studies. His doctoral was in 2014. His academic interests have centered on African American history, particularly in the 20th century, and jazz, culminating in his master's thesis about jazz music written about the civil rights movement, and his doctoral dissertation on the visual and material culture of trumpeter Miles Davis. All the while, he has maintained a really amazing interest in public history and in museum work, and he's included stints at like a who's who of Richmond museums and landmarks. He was a tour guide at the Poe Museum, at the Museum of the Confederacy, at the Valentine Richmond History Center, and he's currently with the National Park Service. He began working for the National Park Service as a seasonal interpretive ranger in 2010, where he's divided his time between Richmond National Battlefield Park and its sister unit, and divided between that and the Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site. Since 2014, he's worked as a permanent park guide at the Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site, doing everything from leading tours of the site for all age groups, managing its social media accounts. We could probably use some help with that with our Tredegar Society. Developing special exhibits and programs, and delivering lectures of the kind that we get to hear tonight. So please join me in welcoming Ben Anderson.
Thank you very much. All right. Okay. All right, well, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Sean, Leo, Brian, Brandon, for having me as well. I got the invitation to come here many months ago back in the fall, and I had 2 reactions. First was very nerdy. I got really excited about the idea of doing history after hours. I think anybody in this business kind of jumps at that chance. We tend to do all of our education during the daylight, and so with it, after 5 o'clock, I think we can still count, even though it's still pretty light out. But I also had never been a part of the Tredegar Society before, so I went and looked back at the history of the organization, and of course all the speakers that have been a part of the series, and was pretty amazed to have been to now be a part of it. What has been a really esteemed group of folks. I know, of course, on the Civil War side, Gary Gallagher, Ed Ayers. These are big shoes to fill, so I'm really honored to be a part of that. This is great. To start off with a little explanation of the program itself. This is a tour that actually started out as an actual bus tour. This was designed by me and the site Maggie Walker site's curator Ethan Bullard. We wanted to do it as part of the site's celebration of Mrs. Walker's 150th birthday, which was 2 years ago, back in 2014. So we developed a set of sites. We rented the bus. We sold tickets. It was a sellout. Everything went extremely well. We were all very, very pleased with how it went. And so naturally, we looked for other opportunities to repeat the performance, and they just have been few and far between. So it occurred to us soon afterwards that it'd be much easier if we turn this the same material into a PowerPoint, make it a lot less or a lot more accessible that way. So what we're going to be doing tonight, as Jamie already outlined, is going to be visiting, essentially virtually visiting all of these sites, her businesses, her church, her birth site, et cetera, seeing them as they looked back then, of course, and also seeing them images of what they look now, kind of the closest thing we can get to actually being on that bus tour, I felt, and really talking about all of those sites here in Richmond and how they connected to Mrs. Walker, in addition to her house, which is where I work, the most obvious site to come learn about her. But I'll start with the very, very basics. We find a lot at our site that it's very common for people to arrive not having known a whole lot about Mrs. Walker at all. So figured go ahead and go over some of the basics just to make sure we're all on the same page before we kind of delve into some of the finer points. So first being, she was an African-American woman, born here in Richmond back in 1864. She will rise to prominence at the turn of the 20th century, leading a large fraternal order called the Independent Order of St. Luke. This is one of many black fraternal orders really cropping up really in the post-Civil War era that were not only social in nature but also benevolent. They called themselves benevolent societies, mutual aid societies, making their money by offering insurance to their members. But she becomes especially famous by starting businesses through the Independent Order of St. Luke. So she'll start a newspaper, for instance, in 1902 called the St. Luke Herald, start a department store in 1905, the St. Luke Emporium, and most famously a bank in 1903 called the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank. We'll talk all about those a little bit later on. But to this day, it is the bank that has really been the one thing that has made her most famous. Having started that bank in 1903, it made her the first African-American female bank president in America, which on its own is a pretty lofty title, but especially, as we like to remind visitors, to remember the context in which this bank was started. This was a bank started from scratch by an African-American, by a woman in the South, in the former capital of the Confederacy, at the height of the Jim Crow era, of course, long before women could even vote in this country. And so, of course, usually when folks hear that, it makes a lot more sense to them why Mrs. Walker is a really nationally prominent figure and why she deserves to be remembered. So Mrs. Walker, in addition to running the Independent Order of St. Luke and managing these multiple businesses, will somehow find the time and energy to get involved in a long list of organizations outside of the Independent Order, many of which were fighting for civil rights for African Americans and equal rights for women. They'll include being on the board of directors of the NAACP for the last 10 years of her life. She was on the national board of the Urban League as well. She was either a treasurer or a vice president of the National Association for Colored Women, the National Negro Bankers Association, the National Negro Business Association, the Negro Organization Society, the National Negro Fraternal Association, the Afro-American Tourist Company, the National Association of Wage Earners. She'll even start her own organization in 1912, the Virginia Council for Colored Women, which raised money to start schools for African-American women, which it does. In 1913, starting the Virginia Industrial School for Women in Hanover County. And so it's a really long, exhaustive list, one that makes us and I think all of our visitors really ask themselves, how was she able to do all of this stuff? And we're still really trying to figure that out. But it reminds us, as we like to tell our visitors, that Mrs. Walker is most famous as a businesswoman, as a banker in particular, but deserves to be recognized for the variety of things that she does outside of that. So all of her activity and activism on the civil rights front, very much an important part of her legacy as well. And if you had to boil down really the essence of her life, really the biggest takeaway as far as I'm concerned, it's how Mrs. Walker was really repeatedly able to overcome adversity in her life. She's someone who, of course, living between the 1860s and then the 1930s, stretching from the end of the Civil War to the Great Depression, will experience a kind of almost an unspeakable amount of racial discrimination and gender discrimination. She will, at the same time, face a lot of tragedy within her own family. There's a 50-year period during her lifetime where she loses a mother, her stepfather, a younger brother, a husband, and 2 of her 3 sons. And of course, the icing on the cake, if you will, is for the last 7 years of her life having to use a wheelchair to get around. She suffered from diabetes as an adult. It'll cut off the circulation to her legs starting in early 1928. And of course force her to have to use a wheelchair for that last period of time. So as I always tell visitors, when you look at just those things, all of those things that she has to asked to overcome in her lifetime. To me, she seems like a really good candidate for someone who would easily get mired in depression, withdraw from society, really lose faith in humanity, and the fact that she simply never does. And she always finds a way to continue to overcome these obstacles, I think, is one of the most inspiring things about her life, and one of the things that's always worth remembering about her as well. So with that in mind, we'll head to the most logical place to begin, and that, of course, is the place Mrs. Walker was born. I know it's a little unusual for someone to address this group and not be talking so directly and primarily about the Civil War. Since we're going to be spending roughly the next 45 minutes mostly in the 20th century, it's nice to be able to go back and really tie Mrs. Walker's story as closely to the Civil War as possible. And we get to do that with this first site. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the name Elizabeth Van Lew, certainly the most famous Union spy here in Richmond. What we see here are images of her house, at least the front, or at least the back part here along Gray Street, between the 23rd and 2400 block of Gray Street, and then, of course, the south portico that would have overlooked the James River while she was living there. Mrs. Walker was born, as she says there at the top, I was born in or at the Van Lew Mansion. It's always been most convenient for us to just say she was born there in the home. Of course, Mrs. Walker reminds us that it may not have been that simple, but she was born there because her mother, Elizabeth Draper, was actually a cook for the Van Lew family. We know that the Van Lews actually had servants' quarters on the grounds. They're not included in these two photos here, so we can't show you an example of what those look like, but because those were there, and I think Mrs. Walker, I guess her mother, we have to assume, did not simply remember that detail. It did not get passed down to her, so she defaults to in or at the Van Lew Mansion. One of the things that really thickens the plot about Mrs. Walker's life, as I like to say, was that she was, of course, as you've already discovered, born in 1864, born during the Civil War, as an African American, born in the home of a Union spy. Her mother, Elizabeth Draper, we know had been born into slavery somewhere in Powhatan County in the late 1840s. We're not sure how she comes to Richmond in the 1860s, but of course she's here in the mid-1860s and does not appear to have been enslaved still at the time Mrs. Walker was born. How did that happen? We really don't know. We couldn't tell you, unfortunately. But to really thicken the plot, we know Mrs. Walker's birth father, her biological father, was a man named Eccles Cuthbert. He was Irish, he was white, he was also a Confederate soldier. And we'll talk a little bit more about him in just a minute. But you put all of these things together, the product of a white Confederate soldier, a black former slave in the home of a Union spy in Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, while the Civil War is going on. I tell people sometimes you just can't make this stuff up. If anyone was really destined to become a really prominent historical figure, all of the elements there that combine to make Mrs. Walker's life possible really set the stage nicely for that. Van Lew's home, as we see here, this is, of course, how it looked during Mrs. Van Lew's lifetime. This was a home that was actually built in 1802. It was built for a man who will actually later become the mayor of Richmond, a man named John Adams. He will later sell it to Van Lew's father, John. John will pass away in 1842, handing the home down to Elizabeth Van Lew's mother and her. And Elizabeth Van Lew will actually live there until her death in 1900, after which it gets turned into a social club for men called the Virginia Club, lasting up until about 1906, 1907, at which point it then gets converted to a tuberculosis hospital, the Churchill Sanatorium, as it was called. And of course, even then, in the early 1900s, tuberculosis was very much a disease to be feared. It was very deadly. A lot of people passed away from it. So everyone seemed to be able to agree this is something that needed to be treated, something that needed to be addressed, but people were a little leery about it being treated so close to them in such a really, really nice, prominent neighborhood. And so there was pressure on the doctor that ran the hospital there to really shut down his operation. He'll eventually give in 1910, leaving the Van Lew home. It'll later get bulldozed, we have to assume in part because it had recently served as a tuberculosis hospital, only to be substituted by what's there today. And that's the image there on the right. That's of the Bellevue Elementary School. That was completed in 1912. So that's what you'll see when you go there today. Whoops. So as I was beginning to mention, one of the most important and really interesting things about the beginnings of Mrs. Walker's life are, of course, to know the people who were involved. We've already talked about Eccles Cuthbert there on the left. He was Mrs. Walker's biological father, her mother, Elizabeth Draper, there in the middle. Then, as I say, Mrs. Walker's stepfather, William Mitchell, there on the right. Since this is a Civil War group, I thought worthwhile going into a little bit of detail about Cuthbert. We know that, again, being from Ireland, he comes to the United States, arriving in South Carolina just before the war breaks out. He joins the 1st Regiment, South Carolina Infantry, finds himself fighting outside of Richmond in 1862 and in 1864, needing medical attention and going where else but Chimborazo Hospital up in Churchill. And that, of course, places him roughly 9 blocks from the home of Elizabeth Van Lew. That's about as close as we can get them. We recently had a visitor to our site who claimed that because of Cuthbert's name, it was likely that he was an Episcopalian. This is a guy from Ireland telling us that. He didn't explain why. This wasn't a guy on my tour, so I couldn't really explain back to you how the last name gave that away. But if that was true, some of you who may have gone to the site of Van Lew's home can attest. What that could have meant was that, of course, coming out of the doors of Mrs. Van Lew's home onto Gray Street, if you look across the street to your right, you're looking at the back of St. John's Episcopal Church. So if that were true, then that, of course, could have put Cuthbert and Draper within just a block of each other. Then it becomes a little easier to imagine how they met. But to be perfectly honest, we still don't know how they met. We'll probably never know. One of our biggest questions is what the nature of their relationship was. Was this a romantic relationship or not? We have no idea. Did they want to pursue marriage? Did they want to pursue something deeper? We'll never know. Of course, it was true then, as it will be in Virginia for over the next 100 years, that interracial marriage was actually outlawed. So even if they had wanted to pursue marriage, that was something they really could not have done legally in Virginia at that time. All we really know for sure is that soon after Mrs. Walker is born in 1864, Cuthbert, for all practical purposes, disappears, really does not go on to have really a meaningful role in her life from that point on. Soon after Mrs. Walker was born, her mother will marry the gentleman that you see there on the far right, William Mitchell. He was a butler for the Van Lews, so much easier for us to know how did they meet. And of course, this is a marriage that will take place in 1868, just a few years later. The two will move soon after their marriage to a home right around the corner from what is now the Medical College of Virginia. It's unfortunately, the home itself is no longer there. The street itself is no longer there. It was once known as College Alley. But the most significant thing to know about that is that this is a home that was right around the corner from what will become, in later years, Mrs. Walker's church, the First African Baptist Church. We see an image of what the church looked like there at the top. We see, during Mrs. Walker's lifetime, we see an image there on the bottom of essentially what it looks like today. That's an image from just a couple of years ago. But the person who really becomes most instrumental in introducing the church to Mrs. Walker is the gentleman that we have there on the left. His name was Reverend James Holmes. He has an interesting history all his own. He had been a slave here in Richmond as well as in New Orleans. He had tried to escape several times. He had been beaten violently for it. So if anyone could really attest to the brutality of slavery, he was it. He was someone who knew that quite well. He becomes the first actual black pastor of First African Baptist Church starting in 1867, once that becomes legal after the Civil War. So he was there when Mrs. Walker, he'll stumble across Mrs. Walker playing on the street, in the mid-1870s. He'll say she was just playing on the street, just bare feet, without a care in the world. And he decided, just on a whim, to introduce her to the church, to bring her into the church, introduce her to a life of Christianity, but also, more importantly, introducing her to the Independent Order of St. Luke. And of course, knowing, as we do now, that she'll not only join the organization soon afterwards, but of course, eventually make her life's work, being the leader of that organization, building on the services that it was providing its community. We can, of course, easily say the rest is history from that point on. The church, though, to back up a minute, does have a really interesting history of its own. This is a church that began as First Baptist Church back in 1780. This was actually an integrated church at that time. and actually continued to be up until the 1840s. The races will actually split in 1841 with the African American congregants forming what becomes known as First African Baptist, and the white congregants forming First Baptist Church. In fact, First Baptist will, after the split, will move just a couple of blocks down the street to a new church that they have built at 12th and Broad Street. They'll be there until sometime in the 1920s when they actually move to where they currently are, the corner of Boulevard and Monument Avenue. So if anyone is interested, that history goes back right there. The African American congregants after the split in 1841 will continue to worship at the church that was on the site of where we see this church today. That's really the corner of Broad and College Street, really close to where Broad and 14th Street is today, right on the crest of Shockoe Hill, the Shockoe Valley. And they'll continue worshiping in a building that was actually constructed back in 1803, but they'll decide to level that building in 1876 and replace it with the one that's here today. That was completed in 1878, and of course it's convenient for us, knowing that Mrs. Walker will actually be baptized and join the church in 1878, that we can really say, we can really align her connection with the church with the completion of this church itself. So that we can, I think, safely say this is the one building that she would have come to know certainly the most, while she was a member there. And I think it's really hard to overstate the significance of the church's role in Mrs. Walker's life. Of course, as you may have already been able to tell, being the leader of an organization called the Independent Order of St. Luke. This is an organization that really draws its strength and inspiration from Christian principles. They'll take their name really from St. Luke, the healer from the New Testament, really as their symbol for their mission of helping others. So this is an organization that is guided by Christian principles. So Mrs. Walker, I think in her personal life and in her professional life, I think we can safely say, again, guided very strongly by Christianity. This church will be where she meets and marries her husband, Armstead Walker, in 1886. It's where his funeral will be in 1915. It's where her son Russell's funeral will be in 1923. It's where her mother's funeral will be in 1922. Mrs. Walker will have her funeral there in 1934 in what was described as the largest funeral for an individual in Richmond since the Civil War. And I think that on its own is a statement worth pausing to contemplate, especially given Richmond's history. And I know you all know very well, having been the capital of the Confederacy, the city was certainly no stranger to hosting large funerals during the war years, but of course these were funerals for white men and Confederate generals. And so to know that once the war ends, not only will 70 years pass before the city sees another funeral quite like those again, but by the time it does, it's for someone remarkably different. This is for an African American, it's for a woman, the leader of a national organization, a successful entrepreneur, and a civil rights activist, and it's just the mid-1930s. The church itself will, of course, continue to operate out of that building until the 1950s. The congregation will eventually sell it to the Medical College of Virginia in 1955. And once owned by what was then known as MCV, now the VCU Medical College or Medical School. It will serve a bunch of different purposes. It'll be a nursing dormitory, it'll be a gymnasium, et cetera, but it is currently the headquarters for the clinical laboratories. So suffice it to say, you can't just walk in off the street and hope to see it on the inside the way it once was. The fact that they still own it, thankfully, means that the building is still there, as you can see, and still in great shape. We can all be very, very thankful for that. But because we can't go inside and see it the way it looked, all the more important, I thought, to take a look at some historic images from inside the church. There in the upper left, I have an image of what the church looked like, taken from Mrs. Walker's time period. And then down below, I thought interesting to point out an image that was actually appears in the Harper's Weekly from the 1860s, showing what the church looked like actually before the church as Mrs. Walker came to know it look like on the inside. So some very, very distinct differences, really, as you all can tell. But neat to be able to see essentially the inner view or the inner part of the church really as close as we can to how Mrs. Walker would have seen it. Always something worth pointing out. We'll move next to Mrs. Walker's headquarters, her office headquarters here in Richmond. She becomes the leader of the Independent Order of St. Luke in the year 1899. Will serve in that capacity for the remaining 35 years of her life. And one of her first mission, once she becomes the leader of the Independent Order, was to actually construct a national headquarters building for the organization. And that was something that hadn't really existed prior to that time. When she becomes the leader of the organization, she inherits what had recently become the national headquarters of the organization. That's the image of the building that you see there on the far left. She will eventually tear it down, build the building that we see there in the middle, completed in 1903. It'll eventually expand to include a fourth floor in 1918, as we can see there on the right. And of course, down at the bottom, we see an image of how the building appears today, another building that thankfully is still with us. But I thought too, again, given the Civil War connections with this group, worth pausing and talking back about that first edition photograph that we have there on the far left. One of the interesting things that had struck me about that building is that after the Civil War, this becomes the home of a former Confederate soldier, a man named George Bright. He had served in the South Carolina Artillery Unit during the war. He'll eventually move to Richmond after the war, marry a Richmonder, and live in that home really for almost the next 30 years of his life before moving to Gray Street. But he sells that home to the Independent Order of St. Luke in 1897. So, of course, as I mentioned, 2 years later, when Mrs. Walker becomes the leader of the organization, that's the headquarters building that she inherits, of course, only to, in a very short time, replace it with the much grander building that we see there in the top two photographs. And what was really interesting for me to learn about that is that it allows us, I think, to think now about Maggie Walker and the Independent Order of St. Luke as actually taking part in what was a much broader pattern after the war of African Americans really reclaiming space and buildings in particular that had been used to advance either, you could say, the cause of slavery or the cause of the Confederacy, however, in different situations, and simply reinvent them to really represent and to advance much newer, a lot more progressive causes. So, for instance, you see that with Lumpkin's Jail, the site that becomes a theological seminary for African Americans after the war, later to be lumped in with Virginia Union in 1899. We see it with the beginnings of Six Mount Zion Baptist Church, which actually starts in 1867 out of a Confederate horse stable on Browns Island. And of course, and I would argue we could essentially say that here, even though this was not a building that was occupied by a Confederate soldier during the Civil War, nonetheless becoming occupied by a Confederate soldier after the war, still in some ways, I think, part of that, taking what had been the home of a former Confederate soldier and really reinventing it as the headquarters of an organization serving purposes, meeting the needs of freed slaves in the South. One of the neat things about this building over the years is that Mrs. Walker will know that the construction of it was really crucial to the growth of the Independent Order of St. Luke. It's why she really makes it the first mission as leader of the organization to have it constructed. She knew that actually having a building of its own that it actually owned outright would actually set the Independent Order of St. Luke apart from a lot of other black fraternal organizations that were doing a lot of the same things that they were doing, particularly providing insurance to its members. So no surprise that over the years, the image of St. Luke Hall will become central to how the Independent Order of St. Luke will brand itself. It'll appear on advertisements for the order in newspapers. Mrs. Walker will, of course, take a lot of opportunities to have photographs taken of her and her staff outside of it, and on the inside as well, a few that I thought I would show. This is one on the inside of the building. This is on the building's third floor, I believe. Taken in 1925, it was included as part of a promotional calendar that the Independent Order of St. Luke put out that year, and showing approximately somewhere between 25 and 30 workers here on the floor. You can see, of course, a very open space. Folks using typewriters and all sorts of old technology that would have, I'm sure, made our ears rattle. A lot of clacking and clinging. Sort of been a highly distracting workplace, I think. But this is an image that Mrs. Walker wanted people to see. As the leader of the Independent Order of St. Luke, she seized on the opportunity to turn this into an organization that not only met African American needs generally, but also specifically met the needs of women. She realized that at the turn of the 20th century, African American women did not have access to a wide variety of jobs, let alone well-paying jobs, which meant that they didn't have access to a wide variety of job skills that could then be transferred into a variety of industries, and thus bring, make the financial outlook and situation for African Americans much more stable in the post-war years. So in all of her big missions as the leader of the order, whether it was running St. Luke Hall, starting all of those businesses that I mentioned at the beginning, she will make a point in each case to actually make sure African American women were hired and were the principal workers in each place, both the department store, the newspaper, of course the bank, and inside the national headquarters. We don't have a lot of images of what the St. Luke Hall looked like on the inside. In fact, the bulk of what we have, I would say, does come from this promotional calendar in 1925. And a lot of the months, if you ever flip through it, I included it as part of our Facebook posts last year, posting a different image from the calendar at the first of every month in 2015. A lot of them were just close-ups of individual workers. Every now and then you'd get a blown-up shot like this. But this is the kind of image that Mrs. Walker wanted to see. She wanted to project this image, really, again, to brand the Independent Order of St. Luke as a very progressive organization that was not only successful in starting these businesses, but again, especially putting women to work. So she will court people to the Independent Order, St. Luke Hall, over and over again, over the years, again, tried to really show off this building, really let people know that it existed. I was able to dig up a couple of really interesting quotes from some journalists during Mrs. Walker's time. She will have, of course, any journalist that interviewed Mrs. Walker during these years, she often had them come meet her at St. Luke Hall, essentially forcing them to come in and see evidence of what she was doing. But she used that opportunity to make some very bold statements. 1908, she'll tell a reporter from Baltimore, for instance, that as you can see, Richmond has become the Athens of the Negro race. Really, of course, talking about her own achievements, but that of a lot of other residents in Jackson Ward who were owning a variety of their own businesses as well, really framing that as a great example of how advanced the race had become and how much people should see African American accomplishments in Jackson Ward as a model for what the race was capable of doing. 6 years later, a reporter from Washington, D.C. will come down to Richmond to interview Mrs. Walker. He will interview her in her office, as was the case and most often, and will come away with a really, I think obviously very, very impressed by what he saw. He will later write in his own article that a trip to Richmond and a failure to see St. Luke Hall and the St. Luke Bank would be like going on a trip to Washington, D.C. and not seeing the Capitol building or the White House. And I think that's a really amazing statement. You might consider sensationalistic to a certain degree, but I think it captures, what people felt was very groundbreaking about her organization and how powerful images like this were to people living at that time. This is not the kind of scene that you would have typically found in a lot of cities across the South. As I mentioned, Mrs. Walker loved to take photographs, have photographs taken of the inside of the building, especially on the outside. In our collection, we have a lot of photographs of her on the outside with staff members from the bank, with various leaders from within the Independent Order of St. Luke. So I had to kind of pick and choose among the ones that we had. I decided to go with one of those there on the top. That, of course, shows Mrs. Walker. If you can see her, she's in the black blouse there in the middle row. That's her and some of the staff members there at St. Luke Hall. And, of course, there on the bottom with some neighborhood children. One of my favorite shots. Of course, always very careful. You can see in the background there in the window in the upper right and that top photograph, as well as right behind her over her right shoulder. Always very careful to have I.O. St. Luke there in the window to make it clear. If you see this photograph later on, you know who it is. You know where it's being taken. So remember that. Pause for a second and just to talk a little bit about how important children were to Mrs. Walker. I think they're actually critical to understanding how she gets in the position to be the leader of the Independent Order of St. Luke in the first place. We know that she had been a member of the organization for many, many years, having joined the Independent Order as a teenager. back when she was still in high school. But she'll make her big mark as a teenage member of the organization by trying to start by starting a membership branch for young people. She called it the Juvenile Division, and she felt that really filled a very important need, because as a teenage member of the organization, she discovered two things right away. One was that she was one of the youngest members in the entire order, and number two, no one seemed interested at all in going out and recruiting young people. And that was a big problem to her. It made it very easy for her to imagine a time in the not-so-distant future that all of these older members would eventually pass away. With them will go the Independent Order of St. Luke. With that goes all the services that it was designed to provide. And so she was determined to change that and make sure that that wasn't the case. And so she really builds her early career on the inclusion of children. She starts the Juvenile Division in 1895. You had to be at least 8 to join. You got a matching hat and jacket when you signed up. It was part of her way of enticing kids. She knew you couldn't just go into the community, tell them about it, and hope they'll sign up. You've got to have some perks for them. You got a rank. You became a cadet. You could take part in beauty contests and dances. There were classes you could take. There was a big annual parade that the cadets did through Richmond every year, making a point of going by Mrs. Walker's home on Lee Street. And so all of these things will eventually prove very successful in drawing large numbers of children into the Independent Order of St. Luke. We know that as an organization, it will peak in the mid-1920s with roughly 100,000 members spread out over 24 states. But we can also say that a fifth of that membership, roughly 20,000 of that 100,000, were juvenile cadets. So this is something that Mrs. Walker will always feel was a major accomplishment of hers, a major contribution to the Independent Order of St. Luke. And I've always imagined that if she were here today, she'd be very quick to remind us that she's not to be just remembered as a banker. This is someone who was always focused on bringing young people into the order too. That was really what she built her career on in the first place. So she was always looking for opportunities to involve children, bring them into the fold. Of course, these folks, these kids down here don't appear to have juvenile cadet uniforms on, but you can imagine her maybe giving them a speech about it and really trying to recruit them. One of the businesses we haven't talked about yet is, of course, the St. Luke Herald. This is the newspaper Mrs. Walker will start in 1902. It'll be based out of the basement of St. Luke Hall. That's where the printing press was from 1902 and then beyond her death in 1934. And it's interesting, I think, to go back knowing, of course, as we do, that she starts a newspaper, ultimately a bank, and a department store, but starts with a newspaper. It's interesting, I think, to go back and understand why she does this. She does it for a very, very critical reason. She knows, first of all, that a lot of other organizations like the Independent Order of St. Luke, black fraternal organizations, didn't necessarily have their own newspapers. There were a lot of black newspapers floating around, but not many organizations like hers could actually boast having their own newspaper. And so she was always looking for opportunities to really set the Independent Order of St. Luke apart from really a sea of black fraternal orders, doing a lot of the same things they had been doing. But she also knew the promotional value of a newspaper. She knew that if people found out that there was a newspaper as part of the order, that will, of course, help draw them into the organization. They'll want to join just to have access to this newspaper. And she also felt this was very important in terms of keeping its members actually informed about what each other was doing. We unfortunately don't have a lot of issues of the St. Luke Herald still around today. A few of them are actually at our site right now. We're lucky to have on loan for the rest of this year a almost mint condition year's worth of the St. Luke Herald that was actually bound. It goes from about March of 1914 to March of 1915. Recently found in the attic of someone's home. They moved into a house in Chesterfield, went up to the attic, found this big bound thing, didn't know what it was, opens it up, has no idea what the St. Luke Herald was, but sees Maggie L. Walker's name in there, knows that we exist, and contacted us and said, is this something you'd be interested in? And of course, we jumped at the chance. So we have that with us now. Thankfully, it is getting digitized as well by the Library of Virginia, so that will, of course, significantly add to the amount of heralds that we know are out there. But given what we have and the few others that also exist, it's pretty clear. This is an organization, or at least a newspaper, that focuses most heavily on news of interest to the Independent Order of St. Luke. That was always what was on the front page. There was world news and local news on inner pages as well, but a lot of promotion for local businesses. And really, again, trying to use a newspaper to bring a sense of community to the organization, knowing that this was, of course, especially as the years go on, and this is an organization that's spread out over multiple states, up and down the East Coast and out into the Midwest, learning about what each other was doing, she foresaw would be very valuable in really kind of maintaining a sense of cohesion and community within the organization. She'll also start, as I mentioned, back at the beginning, a department store back in 1905 called the St. Luke Emporium, and I decided to choose two images here, really as per the really the format of this tour, really to show, of course, there on the top, an image of what the Emporium looked like during Mrs. Walker's lifetime. And essentially what the building looks like today. That's the one in the middle of the photograph there in the bottom, the brick building that has Belle Isle there on front of it, the mural that is still there. The one at the top is not the most perfect image of the Emporium, I could say. I can admit that. One of the reasons I chose it, though, is because it has, if you can actually see closely, an image of the sign going from top to bottom, St. Luke Emporium. A lot of the others, we have a few others that are, much closer up views of the building itself, but don't include that sign. It's not at all obvious, really, when you look at that, what that building is. So I chose it for really that reason, and also to give you a sense of what Broad Street was like when she starts her business there in 1905. This is a pretty diverse place. She has Francione's, an Italian restaurant and hotel. To her left, there is eventually a bar. To her right, and there are Jewish-owned businesses, there are black-owned businesses across the street, jewelers, music shops. And this is really, Broad Street was where black and white Richmond came together. This is really, in some respects, a dividing line, but also kind of the mixing bowl of Richmond during her lifetime. Ultimately, her Emporium will be the least successful of Mrs. Walker's entrepreneurial achievements. It'll only be in business for 6.5 years, opening its doors in April of 1905 and eventually closing down in November of 1911. But certainly does not mean this was not an important business. She starts it, of course, in 1905, puts it out on Broad Street for a reason. There were, of course, several very successful white-owned department stores just a few blocks away, Millen Rhodes, Tallheimers, a few others, that, of course, she wanted to be out front and competing with, since Broad Street was the main shopping district in Richmond at that time. But she also knew that she was filling a void. There really were no other stores in Richmond quite like the St. Luke Emporium that were owned and operated by African Americans that, of course, catered to an African American clientele. And as Mrs. Walker, and of course, many African Americans in Richmond knew all too well at that time, if you walked into a Miller and Rhodes or a Tallheimers, you'd, of course, immediately become subject to discriminatory policies that were actively enforced against you, policies that in some cases did not allow you to try on clothing items before you purchased them, to not allowing you to return them after you had purchased them. We know some rules that were still in place as late as the 1940s, not allowing African American customers to even ring up their own sales until after all white customers within eyesight had been treated first. So all of that, I think, is effective in giving us a sense of the culture that she enters into, why she feels a need to fill that void and create a business like the St. Luke Emporium that allows African Americans, many, I'm sure, for the first time, to actually come into a store like that, shop for the things that they needed, and simply not have to experience all of that discriminatory treatment, all that dehumanizing treatment that was part of it. Again, like the bank ultimately and the printing press and inside of St. Luke Hall, Mrs. Walker will make a point of hiring women to work at the St. Luke Emporium. We know not enough about them, I would say, but we know enough to say they were making some of the dresses and the hats that were being sold there. And I can say as well that even though the Emporium goes on to be the least successful of her entrepreneurial achievements, it is the one, I think, that brings Mrs. Walker so directly into contact with white resistance here in Richmond to a lot of her efforts. A lot of times visitors come to see us, once they learn Mrs. Walker was a successful African American at the turn of the 20th century, a lot of times a question that is soon to follow is, well, how did whites in Richmond react to Mrs. Walker? How did they feel about her? And I think the St. Luke Emporium is a really telling example. Because it was on Broad Street and for a reason to compete with these white-owned businesses, you can maybe start to imagine that they weren't very happy about her being there. Not just, of course, having competition, period, but of course having it from an African American. We know she will write later in a speech in 1906 that before she even opened her store, she was getting threatening letters asking her not to open the store, period. She'll get an anonymous letter in the mail offering her $10,000 to not open the store at all. She will, of course, reject that. She had already invested $12,500 in the store, net loss for her across the board, and was not willing to do that. And even after she opens the store, she essentially runs into what I think we could call a boycott, really, from the white community. It will be discovered, likely by some of the owners and employees of these white-owned department stores, that Mrs. Walker had secured a contract with a clothing manufacturer in New York. They were to supply some of the clothing that was sold at the St. Luke Emporium, and when they found out that this is the same manufacturer that had been supplying them, that they have a contract with, that was unacceptable. They'll call New York and they'll say, you either stop selling to Mrs. Walker or we'll stop buying from you. And this will, in the end, unfortunately for Mrs. Walker, have very negative consequences. Of course, compared to these larger white-owned department stores, hers was an unknown quantity. The folks in New York had no idea, how big of an account her store will come to represent. Of course, all they knew is that the white-owned stores were very successful, well-established, and so the folks in New York will give in. They agreed not to sell to Mrs. Walker. And so right off the bat, in addition to all of these anonymous threats and offers to not open her business, she has to open it in 1905 without a lot of the merchandise that she really wanted to sell in there. Merchandise that I'm sure she expected would be a key factor in bringing people into the store. Ultimately, the store will go on to experience less than stellar sales over the years. I think we can definitely say that, even though the records, specific bank records, don't really exist. But the saving grace for it was that up until 1911, this was a store that could be legally funded by the Independent Order of St. Luke. So even though all the sales that Mrs. Walker wanted weren't being transacted in the store, it was staying alive, really, by money from the Independent Order of St. Luke. But Virginia will put a halt to that in 1911. The State Insurance Commission will come around and essentially make it illegal for black fraternal organizations like the Independent Order of St. Luke that were involved in insurance to actually continue funding businesses that they had investments in. And it turns out that had become a very common thing. Organizations like United Order of True Reformers, the Knights of Pythias, had money tied up in theaters and banks and lots of other businesses across town. So this had become a common trend. But the State Insurance Commission, their whole argument was that if an insurance-based organization like the Independent Order of St. Luke has money from its membership and its clientele tied up in these non-insurance related businesses, and if those businesses fail, then it puts the Independent Order and these other organizations in a pretty rough spot. It makes them less able to be able to pay on claims that are being made. And so, as far as the state was concerned, it was forcing a separation between these organizations and their businesses in the name of consumer protection. It wanted residents of Virginia to know that if they buy an insurance policy in the state of Virginia, their money is not going into an organization that might invest it in a separate business. And so as far as the state was concerned, it was doing this in the name of consumer protection. But of course, by 1911, because of the lower than expected sales, the fact that the Emporium was no longer able to be funded by the Independent Order, of course, meant its demise. So it will close in the fall of 1911. We can be thankful, I think, in a way, that the building is still with us today to remind us that it existed. It was at 112 East Broad Street, and I don't know who did it, but if you go to 112 East Broad, you'll actually stand out in front of that building. Someone has painted 112 there at the top, so making it very easy and obvious which building that was. But it has been abandoned for many years. We know the current owner of the building lives in D.C. We're not sure what his plans are for it. But what has survived of the building is really just the front of it. The back of it, you can go around to an alley and see there's really nothing else to speak of for the building. So doesn't look like we don't know of any plans really to rehabilitate that building anytime soon. We'll, of course, keep an eye on that, but it's worth everybody keeping an eye on, I think, for that matter. But at least the front is there. The facade of the building is there. Excuse me. As I mentioned before, Mrs. Walker makes a point of running the Independent Order of St. Luke and, as I said, hiring women to work there. And one of the interesting things we found in our collection is actually an image of the Emporium there in the middle on the left, surrounded by employees at the Independent Order of St. Luke. And as you can see, of course, women had a major presence there, but this was also a co-ed staff. There's men and women, so she never excluded men from any of these ventures, but she made a point primarily of hiring women. And two people, I think, for our purposes, are worth pointing out. One is Mrs. Walker's son, Melvin. He's second from the right there at the bottom. It was one of his first jobs when the Emporium opens in 1905. He's 11 years old. And so she puts him to work right away on the floor, selling some of the clothes there. So, of course, reminding us that running the Independent Order of St. Luke and managing all these businesses was, to a certain degree, a family affair for the Walkers. The other person I thought you all might be interested in was the gentleman on the top row, second from the left, this guy here. His name was Joseph Myers, and we didn't know a whole lot about him until just a few months ago. Looking into his story, he was the vice president of the department store for the entire time that it was open, from 1905 to 1911. But when he leaves the department store, guess where he comes to work? Tredegar Ironworks. He comes here. He works here for many, many years. And so it was one of the great connections that we were able to make between our site and, of course, our sister sites on the battlefield. He will later sign off, be one of the folks honoring, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the names now, but a very prominent German family that comes to work at Tredegar, many generations of them working here. I forget the last name. Osterbein, yeah, one of a eulogy, or excuse me, an obituary for one of the Osterbeins will appear in the St. Luke Herald, co-authored by Joseph Myers. So obviously a very close connection there in a lot of ways. Interesting to know that his boss goes from being Maggie Walker to I suppose at that time still Joseph Anderson's son, right, at that time, Archer, if I remember correctly. Of course, the image on the right, one of the only images that actually exists from the inside of the Emporium, of course, showing Mrs. Walker, a very staged photograph, showing her on the right, of course, talking to one of her female employees there on the left. This was a 3-story building and had an elevator in the back, really designed to be a very, very modern place in all respects. We'll shift from there really to the bank. This is the final business we'll really shine a light on. And before really ever talking about the bank, I always feel it's really important to really address the name issue right off the bat, since that is it can be really one of the more confusing elements of the bank's history. This is a bank that gets started in 1903 as the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank. It'll change in 1923 to become the St. Luke Bank and Trust Company. And then following the stock market crash in '29, we'll merge with 2 other black-owned banks in Richmond to form what becomes known as Consolidated Bank and Trust Company. And actually was under that name at the time Mrs. Walker passes away in 1934. A bank with that name actually continued to exist as an independently owned and black-run bank here in Richmond up until 2005 when it gets bought out by a small chain based out of Massachusetts called the Abigail Adams Corporation. They'll own it for 6 years, deciding not to change the name during those 6 years. So I suppose it's possible if you had an account at the bank and you didn't know about the buyout, it's possible that since the name didn't change, you might not have known anything had changed. But in 2011, most recently, it was bought out a second time, this time by another small chain called Premier Bank. They're based out of West Virginia. They have since decided to replace the name of Consolidated Bank with their own. And so we have a bank that changes names quite a bit over the years. It also changes location. This is a bank that starts off in the first floor of St. Luke Hall in 1903. It'll move to share space with the Emporium on Broad Street in 1905. And once the Emporium closes in 1911, moves to what was, during Mrs. Walker's lifetime, the most permanent location of the bank at the corner of First and Marshall Streets. And we'll see an image of it in just a minute, but in 1974, the bank will move across the street into the building that's actually there now. This is what becomes Consolidated Bank in 1974. But I thought this image was particularly telling. This is from the Valentine's collection, taken soon after the new bank building was completed, and showing in the reflective glass there, the mirrored glass there, the image of the old bank that Mrs. Walker had constructed back in 1911. So a little bit of the old and the new. It's an important image, I think, in the end, a very symbolic image in a lot of ways, especially considering the fact that soon after Consolidated opens up operations in that building, they will level the old bank. So if you go to the intersection of First and Marshall today, and you're facing south there in the middle of First Street on the left, where Mrs. Walker's bank used to be, you'll see an open parking lot. And on the right, you'll see, of course, what is now known as Premier Bank. So all of it means that we have drifted a little farther away as the years have gone on from the core of what Mrs. Walker started. This is no longer an independently run black-owned bank. no longer bears the name of the bank that she started. It's no longer in the same building that she remembered. But thankfully, the folks at Premier Bank do have a portrait of Mrs. Walker there in the lobby. So for folks who go in there and have an account, there's a way to connect the two. Of course, a better image of the bank at First and Marshall is there on the left, along with an image, one of the rare images that we have of the inside of the bank there down in the bottom right, showing a teller cage. Those of you that may have been on tour with us before, we have an exhibit hall on the grounds that includes a room where we talk about all of Mrs. Walker's businesses, and we decided to replicate, that teller cage in one of the rooms, including all the images of the people that you see behind it, which includes Mrs. Walker there on the right, on the left, Emmett Burke, her cashier. He was her number 2 at the bank from when it starts in 1903. Eventually still the cashier when it merges and becomes Consolidated Bank in 1930. She'll promote him to president of the bank soon after that. She becomes chairman of the board, so a very trustworthy aide there. And then her son Russell there in the back. So again, like Melvin working at the Emporium, another reminder, this was very much a family affair. So in the end, why does this tour matter? Just to wrap things up. First of all, we were inspired to start this tour, really, plan for a tour like this, because specifically it allowed us to go beyond the limitations of our site. There's a lot that's great about our site. If you haven't been, of course, I'll be the first to encourage you to go by. But the centerpiece of the site is Mrs. Walker's home. That's what we see there in the image to the right. We are extremely lucky to have it still with us. It was a home that was cared for after Mrs. Walker's death in 1934 for many, many years by members of her family, and eventually sold directly by them to the National Park Service, allowing us to say that over 90% of what's on display in the house is actually original. And so it's one of those rare opportunities in the world of historic homes to see a house almost the exact way its famous owner used to. You don't get that opportunity in houses that often. So, and so there's a lot to love and be very lucky and be very thankful about when it comes to the house and the way it's been preserved. But we also have to admit, this is not where she was born. It's not where she attended school. It's not where she went to church. It's not where she ran the Independent Order of St. Luke. She never started a business out of this home. So, as much as it allows us a really intimate and authentic look inside her private life, we're limited when it comes to interpreting the house and also having to talk about her professional life as well. So, so that's one of the reasons that we wanted to go beyond that and talk about these other sites. These are sites that also vary greatly in interpretation and preservation. If you actually go around to these sites today, you'll see very little interpretation on the grounds of them that will actually tell you what they were, let alone make it clear what Mrs. Walker's connection to them is. That's being corrected, at least in some places. At the Van Loo home, there is a historic marker, not too old, there that does mention Maggie Walker on it. The First African Baptist Church has a relatively new state historical marker outside of it. The site of Mrs. Walker's bank that is now a parking lot has a very tombstone-like stone marker out there that talks a little bit about the bank. It's easily missed since it actually blends in with the color of the parking lot. But the Emporium, there's nothing there. You go to of course, St. Luke Hall, it has St. Luke building out there, written across it. So there's certainly a way to make that connection there, but there's no interpretation, nothing telling you about the building itself, nothing connecting it obviously to Mrs. Walker. So, in the end, what we have are sites that really exist along a pretty wide spectrum as far as their preservation too. These are sites that are no longer there. They've been replaced by other buildings. They're sites that are no longer there and haven't been replaced with anything. There are sites that actually are still there but have been abandoned and are in bad shape. There are sites that are still there but are in pretty good shape, but only because they've been repurposed and being used for other things. So they really, really run the gamut there, which means I think it's all the more important for us certainly to be reminded of what they were, since we're dealing with a complex set of details. But in the end, we always hope that by increasing the awareness of these buildings that people will become more aware, certainly of the importance of them and decide to get more involved as far as their preservation is concerned. Here in Richmond, I've just talked about a set of 5 sites that are very intimately connected to Mrs. Walker, that are worthy of preservation on their own. But you step away from Mrs. Walker for a little bit, and you isolate any number of other very famous Richmonders, and you start to try to develop a tour like this. You're likely going to run into a lot of spots very similar to the ones that we've covered here tonight. Places where this is a site significant to to Edgar Allan Poe, for instance, where he was raised at 5th and Main. That's now a hair studio. Bob Cole's hair design. A guy who, back when I was working there, a big story was how begrudgingly Bob Cole was to put a big marker on the side of the building. He didn't want to acknowledge that it used to be the Poe sign. He thought that would turn away business. But there are sites like that all over the city, and it's important that I think the more we know about them, of course, the more I think the more active participants we will become in their preservation. And I wanted to finish off with one great quote I discovered very recently, ties in with this theme really, really well. After Mrs. Walker passes away in December of 1934 at the age of 70, of course, memorials and eulogies, were numerous at the actual site of her funeral, but in the newspapers, particularly black newspapers across the country, people who couldn't attend the funeral were sending in written tributes to Mrs. Walker. And one of them that will appear in a paper in December 1934 comes from a man named A.W. Brown. He had been the pastor of 6 Mount Zion Baptist Church in Richmond. And he says, "Friends need not build any monument to Mrs. Maggie L. Walker. She did that better than any other mortal ever could while she was alive. She erected a material monument in brick, stone, and mortar in the bank building and in the spacious office building of the St. Luke Order, and she erected a spiritual monument in the hearts of the boys and girls and the men and women of our race who heard her speak, read what she wrote, or what others wrote about her. There is nothing that we can do save to perpetuate these monuments by preserving what she has done for generations yet unborn." So it is my hope that you'll help participate in that process as we move forward. So, thank you all very much. Sure. Yeah, I realized we kind of went over a little bit. But yeah, any questions? I'd love to have them.
Ben, what is the building that was the Order of St. Luke's Hall used as today? Where is that exactly?
That's a great question. It's at the corner of St. James and Baker Streets in what we now call North Jackson Ward, ever since, of course, the interstate comes along in the late 50s, early 60s, effectively dividing Jackson Ward into 2 parts. We now have what's often called Historic Jackson Ward, where our site is on the south side of the interstate, and then her office building on what we now call the north side, North Jackson Ward. And it's been abandoned for many, many years. We know that it was the headquarters for the Independent Order, at least up until the 1940s or so. Our knowledge really, believe it or not, of what it gets used for, really by the 1950s gets a little fuzzy. It's harder to track that down in newspapers. Articles that used to talk about, meetings there at the building, stopped mentioning that, making it harder for us to know. The building gets used, for a lot of different things, in the years after that. I think it was a daycare most recently. If you go in there, it's really hard to get inside the building now since it is privately owned. But I've been lucky enough to get in a couple of times. You can actually see, old, bulletin boards with, so that like little wavy, kind of truffled lining that you can kind of tell was from an era when kids were there, and the artwork was printed on there. It was an office for political candidates in the 1980s. It was a site of some pop-up museums focusing on black history back in the 70s and 80s too. So it's been used for a lot of different things over the years, but currently privately owned, been abandoned, I'd say, effectively for the last roughly 30 years, 25, 30 years. So it's in pretty bad shape. If you go in there now, not a lot really of note. You still walk in, if you go in off of St. James Street, you walk in, you'll still see, a semblance of this grand entrance that Mrs. Walker had designed. There's a really nice, wide marble staircase that kind of greets you as you walk in. There's an elevator that she had installed in 1918 that's in the far back. You can see some evidence of that still being there. All the offices were up on the top floor. We actually have identified where her office was, but all of the walls are down. So it's just the infrastructure, all the studs really just around that. We'd have to really do a lot of work to recreate that. So it's in pretty bad shape. One other thing that I will mention about it very quickly, and what's neat about it is that even though it is in really rough shape, we don't know what will come of the building. I always like to say that it has so far had the last laugh as far as contributing to our knowledge about Mrs. Walker. Some of you may have read that back in 2009, some students from William & Mary, not me, unfortunately, I wish it was me, but some of them actually were taking a class on Maggie Walker. They come to Richmond, they get a tour of the inside of St. Luke Hall, and one of them asks to go up in the attic. They were curious about what was up there, and the owner lets them do it. And lo and behold, up in the attic were what has amounted to be roughly 10,000 documents that belonged to Mrs. Walker that, lo and behold, go into a lot of detail about the last 4 or 5 years of her life. I was lucky to have been a part of the students' work on those papers in the following year and a half. So I got to see a glimpse of what was in that collection, but it's still really being held under close control down there. It's not really accessible to researchers, unfortunately. But if you look at what is the most definitive biography to date on Mrs. Walker, it has a nice rhythm, nice momentum up until you get to those last few years of her life. And that's where the source material for the author really drops off a cliff. Thank you all very much.